Marcus Hale thought the worst part of closing shifts at Fairview Mart would be boredom until he saw the security footage of himself walking through the aisles while he was still sitting in the office. I started my new job at a small retail store on the edge of town. From the outside, it looked like any other neighborhood ShopRite windows displaying neat rows of products, friendly posters announcing discounts, and the warm glow of fluorescent lights spilling onto the cracked sidewalk. But the moment I stepped inside for my first evening shift, something felt wrong. It wasn't anything I could see. Everything looked perfectly normal. It was the air. It felt too still, almost heavy, as if the store was holding its breath, waiting. My shift began at 6 in the evening. Just as the last of the after-work shoppers filtered out, the first hour was uneventful. Just the sound of the hum from the refrigerators and the distant rumble of passing cars. But once the front doors shut behind the final customer, the silence deepened in a way that didn't feel natural. It wasn't the kind of silence you get when a place is empty. This one pressed in around me like it had weight. Every small sound seemed sharper: the squeak of my shoes on the linoleum, the faint buzz of the ceiling lights, the quiet creak of metal shelves settling under the weight of cans and boxes. I tried to shake it off by keeping busy. I cleaned the counter, wiped down the glass doors of the coolers, and began tidying up the aisles. The store wasn't big, just 5 main aisles and a small stockroom in the back. As I worked my way toward aisle 4, I thought I caught something out of the corner of my eye, a flicker of movement at the far end, near the paper goods. I turned quickly, but the aisle was empty. Only tall shelves stacked with toilet paper, paper towels, and napkins. I told myself it was just my imagination. After all, I was new, unfamiliar with the small noises and tricks of the light in this place. But as I moved on, I became more aware of it, the faint sense of being watched, not from any one direction, but from everywhere at once, as though the store itself had eyes. I would glance over my shoulder for no reason, half expecting to see someone standing there. Each time there was nothing but shelves and products arranged in perfect, unnatural order. When I reached the cleaning supplies section, I knelt to straighten a row of bottles and heard something faint, a slow, dragging sound. It seemed to be coming from the next aisle over. I froze, listening. It wasn't like footsteps, more like something being pulled across the floor. The sound stopped as soon as I stood up. I took a deep breath, telling myself I'd check later, and went back to work. Eventually, I made my way toward the stockroom. The door was old and painted white, with a metal handle that was cold to the touch. Something about it made me hesitate. Maybe it was the way the overhead light above it seemed dimmer than the others, or maybe it was the fact that the air felt colder here. I reached for the handle, but then noticed something on the surface of the door, a smudge in the layer of dust. I leaned closer and realized it wasn't just a smudge, it was a handprint. It was much larger than mine, with fingers that looked too long, stretching unnaturally far. The print wasn't fainted, it was pressed deep into the dust, as if whoever made it had leaned hard against the door. The sight of it made my stomach tighten. This wasn't the kind of mark you'd see from a casual touch. Whoever left it had been standing there for a long time, maybe listening. The strange thing was, I had walked past this door earlier in the evening, and it had been clean. No marks, which meant that while I had been working, someone or something had been here. I looked down the aisle behind me, but the view was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was seconds too late, that if I had turned around just a little sooner, I would have seen something standing there. I forced myself to push the thought away, but the unease didn't fade. Instead, it clung to me like a shadow, making every corner seem darker, every sound sharper. Somewhere deep down, I knew this was only the beginning of whatever was wrong in this store, and as I stood there staring at that large, unnatural handprint, I couldn't help but wonder if it was waiting for me to open the door. The next night, I arrived for my shift earlier than usual, thinking maybe more time to settle in would help me feel less uneasy. But from the moment I stepped inside, that same stillness wrapped around me. It wasn't just quiet, it was the kind of silence that seemed to listen. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, but their steady hum only made the emptiness feel louder. I tried to focus on simple tasks, stacking shelves and checking expiration dates, anything to keep my thoughts occupied. But it was impossible not to notice how certain items seemed to be slightly out of place. A row of soup cans that I had perfectly aligned the night before now sat unevenly, like someone had moved them after I'd gone. A broom leaned against the cooler, even though I was sure I'd left it in the supply closet. I told myself the morning shift probably moved things around. That was the most reasonable explanation. Still, my eyes kept flicking toward the far ends of the aisles, scanning for movement I wasn't sure I wanted to see. An hour into my shift, I decided to check the security cameras in the back office. The monitors displayed grainy, black and white footage of each aisle. I stared at them for a long time, letting my eyes roam over every shelf and corner. Everything seemed fine until I reached the feed for aisle 5. At first I thought the screen was glitching. A tall, thin shape stood at the far end of the aisle, motionless. It was too far away for me to make out details, but the proportions seemed wrong. Arms hanging slightly too low, legs just a little too long. The figure didn't sway or move like a person would. It just stood there, as still as the products around it. I blinked hard, and when I looked again, the aisle was empty. I told myself it was a trick of the camera, maybe a shadow from a passing car outside. Still, I couldn't stop myself from leaving the office and walking toward aisle 5. My footsteps echoed unnaturally loud against the floor. The air felt heavier the closer I got, like walking into a space that hadn't been disturbed in a long time. When I turned the corner, there was no one there. The shelves were neatly stocked with chips and candy, nothing out of place. But in the center of the floor sat a single shoe. It didn't belong to anyone I recognized. It was old, scuffed, and covered in a fine layer of dust. The oddest thing was the direction it faced. It wasn't toward the aisle or the exit, but toward the shelf, like whoever had been wearing it had been standing inches away from the wall. I bent down to look at it, but stopped halfway. The inside of the shoe wasn't empty. In the dim light, I saw something white and brittle resting where the foot would be. At first I thought it was a small piece of paper, but as I leaned closer, I realized it was bone, a single curved fragment that looked like it had once been part of a rib. I straightened up quickly, heart pounding, and backed away from the shoe. My hands felt cold, and my skin prickled as though the air itself had turned against me. I wanted to leave it where it was, to just walk away and pretend I hadn't seen it. But even as I stepped out of the aisle, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been standing there only moments before I arrived. Back in the office, I checked the cameras again. The shoe was still there, right in the middle of the aisle. But this time, there was something else. On the screen, faint and almost transparent, a shadow stretched along the floor next to the shoe. It was shaped like a person but far too tall, its head nearly brushing the top of the shelves. The strange part was that in the live feed, the shadow didn't move at all, not even when I moved my own camera view slightly. I stared at the screen, afraid to blink. And then, without warning, the feed for aisle 5 cut to static. By the third night, the dread began before I even reached the store. The sight of its glowing windows from the parking lot made my stomach tighten. The air outside felt cool and normal, but the moment I stepped through the sliding doors, everything shifted. The stillness was heavier than ever, thick enough that I could almost taste it. The sound of the lights buzzing above me seemed deeper, like it was coming from somewhere underground rather than overhead. I told myself I was imagining things, that maybe the long shifts were making me paranoid. Still, every part of me was alert, listening for the smallest noise. My shoes squeaked faintly on the floor, and the sound seemed to carry far too far, like the store was emptying itself of air so my steps would echo longer. I moved quickly through my tasks, wanting to finish early, stocking shelves, refilling the freezer, organizing the cleaning products, anything to keep my mind focused. But the store felt different tonight, like it was rearranging itself when I wasn't looking. I'd pass one aisle and find it completely empty, only to return a few minutes later and see it full again. The products were always neatly lined up, but sometimes the labels faced the wrong way, as though something had been looking at them from the other side of the shelf. Halfway through the shift, I started hearing them footsteps in the aisles behind me. They were slow and deliberate, spaced apart just enough to make me stop and listen each time. I would turn around, and the aisle would be empty. Then I'd take a few steps forward, and the sound would start again, this time from another direction. It was like the steps were circling me, moving in ways I couldn't see. I tried to convince myself it was the building settling, but then I noticed something that made my skin crawl. Dust, thin lines of dust running across the floor, broken only where something had stepped. The marks didn't look like shoe prints. They were longer, stretched, and the spacing between them was uneven, like whatever made them didn't walk like a person. I avoided the stockroom for as long as I could, but eventually I needed to grab a box of inventory from the back. The air near the stockroom door felt colder, just like it had the first night. When I opened the door, the light inside flickered once, then steadied. The smell hit me immediately, musty, damp, and faintly metallic. As I stepped inside, I noticed something taped to the freezer door. At first I thought it was a note, but when I got closer I saw it was a child's drawing. Crayon lines in shaky colors, showing a tall black figure standing next to a row of shelves. Its head was bent at an unnatural angle, and beside it was a smaller shape that looked like a person, drawn entirely in red. I stared at it for a long time before pulling it down, but the paper felt damp in my hands, like it had been hanging there for far longer than it should have. I turned to throw it away, and that's when I saw it leaning against the far wall, half hidden behind a stack of boxes. A mirror, cracked in several places, the glass smeared with dust. I stepped closer, and for a moment, I thought it was just my own reflection staring back. But the longer I looked, the more I realized something was wrong. My eyes in the reflection were too dark, almost black, and my mouth was slightly open, like I was whispering to someone just out of frame. My chest tightened. I stepped back quickly, but my reflection didn't move right away. For a fraction of a second it stayed where it was, still leaning forward, still whispering before snapping into alignment with me. I dropped the drawing without meaning to, and the sound of paper hitting the floor seemed far too loud in the silence. Then, just as I turned toward the door, I heard it again, a whisper close to my ear. words I couldn't understand, but cold enough that they made my whole body tense. I spun around, but the room was empty. The mirror, however, was no longer showing just me. In the space over my shoulder, something tall and thin was standing in the reflection, perfectly still. I didn't want to come back after that night, but quitting didn't feel like an option yet. I kept telling myself I needed the money, that maybe the strange things were just tricks of a tired mind. But when I stepped inside on the fourth evening, the air felt wrong immediately. It wasn't just still, it was heavy, pressing down on me like a weight. My ears felt muffled, as though the store was swallowing sound. Even the familiar hum of the lights seemed slower, dragging in a low, droning tone that made my skin crawl. I decided I needed to know if whatever was happening here was real, or if I was losing my mind. Before closing, I set up a small test. In the middle of aisle 3, I built a neat pyramid of canned goods, 6 on the bottom, 3 in the middle, 1 on top. I measured the space around them, marking the floor with faint lines from a dry marker. I wanted to see if anything would disturb them during the night. I went about the rest of my shift as normally as possible, avoiding the stockroom entirely. Still, I couldn't escape the strange shifts in the air. More than once, I walked through a section of the store and felt a sudden drop in temperature, like stepping into a cold draft, even though there were no vents or open doors nearby. At one point, I passed aisle 5 and thought I saw something move at the far end, but it didn't T-walk or turn. It simply tilted, like a shadow bending against the wrong direction of light. By the time I returned to aisle 3, an hour had passed. The pyramid of cans was still standing. I felt a small surge of relief until I noticed something odd. All the labels were now facing inward. I had left them facing out toward the customers, but now every can had been turned so the printed side was hidden. I hadn't heard or seen anyone come through. I reached for the top can, and that's when I saw it. One of the labels had been torn open in a thin, clean line, revealing something black and wet inside. It wasn't food. It didn't look like anything I'd ever seen in a store, thick, glistening and pulsing faintly as if it were alive. A faint metallic smell rose from it, sharp enough to make my stomach turn. I set the can down and backed away quickly. The air around me felt thicker now, almost sticky against my skin. My vision seemed slightly off, like the lights above were dimming, even though I could still see. I decided to call it for the night and leave early. When I reached the front doors, I pulled out my keys, but something was wrong. The lock had changed. The small, familiar keyhole was gone, replaced by a jagged, uneven gap in the metal, as though it had been melted or warped. My keys wouldn't fit. I tried again, forcing them, but they slipped uselessly in my hand. A low creak echoed behind me, coming from the register area. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat. Someone or something was standing behind the counter. Its head was tilted far to one side, too far for a person's neck. The rest of its body was hidden by the register, but I could see the long fingers of one hand resting lightly on the countertop. The fingers twitched once, slowly curling inward. I blinked and it was gone. The space behind the counter was empty again, but the register drawer was open. I stepped closer despite every instinct screaming not to. Inside there was no money, just a single tooth lying in the center. Fresh, clean, and wet, as though it had been pulled seconds ago. The air seemed to close in around me then, pressing against my skin until I could barely breathe. Somewhere in the store I heard the slow sound of something dragging across the floor. Moving closer, I turned back toward the front doors, but the glass was no longer transparent. It was black, completely black, like the world outside had been erased. On my last night I told myself I wouldn't let the shift go past midnight. I planned to finish everything quickly and get out, no matter what. But the moment I stepped inside I knew the store wouldn't let me go so easily. The air was worse than ever, thick and unmoving, pressing against me until my chest felt tight. The lights flickered once, twice, then steadied in a dim glow that seemed weaker than usual. I moved fast, stocking shelves, wiping counters, and keeping my eyes down. I avoided looking at the corners, the aisles, or the reflections in the cooler doors. But no matter how hard I tried to focus on the work, I could feel it, the presence, stronger than it had ever been. It wasn't just watching now, it was waiting. The first real sign came when I passed aisle 1. The shelves were full earlier, but now they were empty. Every product was gone. The bare metal racks stretched down into shadow, and the sound in that space was different, like the air was thicker inside. I didn't want to step into it, but I couldn't help leaning just enough to glance down the length of the aisle. That's when I saw them, people. At least 24 of them, standing perfectly still in rows along the empty shelves. They were all facing away from me, their bodies stiff, their heads slightly tilted as if listening to something I couldn't hear. Their clothes were wrong, too old, too faded, as though they had been standing there for years. I stepped back slowly, my heart pounding so hard it made my vision shake. I moved toward the back office, thinking maybe I could lock the door and call someone, anyone. But when I reached the other aisles, I froze. They were in every one of them. The same still figures, standing in unnatural silence. None of them moved, not even to breathe. The more I looked, the more I realized there was something wrong with their shapes. Their arms seemed just a little too long. their shoulders hunched at unnatural angles, as though their bones had been rearranged. I backed into the office, slamming the door shut. My hands shook as I turned toward the monitors, needing to know if I was imagining this. But the cameras didn't show the aisles. Every screen displayed only one image, my own face, staring directly into the lens. It didn't make sense. I wasn't in front of any camera. Yet the image was clear, too clear, like it was being filmed from inches away. I leaned closer to the monitor, and that's when I noticed my reflection was smiling. My own mouth was closed, but on the screen, my lips were curling upward in a slow, unnatural grin. The smile widened, stretching my face in ways that felt wrong even to look at. Then the version of me on the screen raised its hand and waved slowly. My real arm stayed at my side, frozen in place. I couldn't move. A sound began to build in the walls around me, a low, steady hum that grew louder until it was more like a vibration under my skin. The lights in the office flickered, and for a split second, the screens showed something else. Not me, not the aisles. Just darkness, with dozens of faint white shapes moving slowly toward the camera. Shapes with long limbs, bending at impossible angles, their heads jerking slightly as they advanced. Then the feed snapped back to my face, still smiling. The door behind me creaked and I felt the air shift, as if something had just entered the room. My eyes stayed locked on the screen. I didn't want to turn around. I couldn't. My reflection leaned closer to the camera until its face filled the screen. Eyes completely black. Something cold touched the back of my neck. Not a hand. Something thinner, sharper. The smile on the screen twitched, and then the monitor went dark. I don't remember leaving the store. I don't remember anything after that moment. But when I woke up, I was standing in an aisle, facing the shelves, tilting my head, listening.